Thank you. What fun to be here. It's a huge honor to be selected for this award. I love laboratory science. What can I say? I have done many experiments over the years, and I will thank you right now, actually, because it's work from brilliant people like you that have made what I did possible. And I'll try to remember to put in some of the details of that, because evolution is all about function, and function is all about measurement. But I'll start by introducing the people who really are responsible for what I've been able to do, and this is my group a couple of years ago. Brilliant young people who are devoted to learning and to achievement, and I understand there are a number of students here as well. So I want to, first of all, give a little bit of advertisement for Southern California. It's a very nice place to come for graduate school, so remember that when you're writing out your applications. Now, I'm also here to tell you about innovation in the biological world. When I went to graduate school, this was a long time ago, it was the beginning of the DNA revolution. I was at Berkeley when Amgen was a startup company. And this was such an exciting time for me as a young engineer, because I realized there was a whole new industry that was going to come from the ability to cut and paste DNA for the first time. And I said, I want to be an engineer, not of building devices and chemical factories. I want to be an engineer of the biological world. I want to rewrite the code of life to do things for human beings. And the medium that I wanted to work with was enzymes, who are the best chemists on the planet. That peeves some of my colleagues, but when you think about these remarkable molecular machines that can convert carbon dioxide and sunlight and simple starting materials into a tree, into you and me, that chemistry, basically all the transformations of the biological world, happens cleanly, sustainably. No human chemist can mimic, much less master, chemistry like that. So it's a fabulous model for being able to do chemistry the way it should be done. All right, so I felt that we needed better enzymes. Why do we need better enzymes? Well, when an enzyme is evolved in a biological system, it does its job beautifully for the host that invented it. But if you take an enzyme out of its context and ask it to do something for you, work in a diagnostic system or synthesize a new chemical, it's generally a little bit less enthusiastic. And so the feeling was that we needed to develop processes around these picky enzymes. But I said, no, I want to develop the enzymes to fit into the process. So it was a great idea, right, to recognize that protein engineering would be a future important technology, but I had no clue how to do it. That was the next challenge. So back then, all the experiments were difficult. We had to, it was hard to make mutations in a protein. If you did, you usually destroyed the function, so we called it protein terrorism instead of protein engineering. And all the methods were terrible 40 years ago. But let's fast forward and talk about today, because the difficulties are still there. What's easy today is we can read any DNA we want, right? Gene sequencing is phenomenal, and it's gone from $3 billion for a human genome down to less than $100. Phenomenal increases in our capability. We can write any DNA we want. You can type out, email off your favorite sequence to your favorite supplier, and you'll get the physical DNA back in the mail. That's also pretty amazing. We can edit any DNA. The Nobel Prize in Chemistry went to Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier in 2020 for the ability to go in and make detailed modifications to the DNA inside of living cells. Phenomenal technology. So you can read, write, edit, but what we couldn't do, and this is the problem that I'll talk to you about tonight, is we couldn't compose it. 40 years ago, we couldn't compose it. Today, we're learning a little bit about it. AI might come in and save us. But nobody can compose the code of life for an enzyme that's really good. So to me, it's like a Beethoven symphony, right? These are complex, highly functional, beautiful compositions, and they're the products of 4 billion years of evolution. So how do you compose a new enzyme? Nobody knows how to sit down and do that. We're not Beethovens, and certainly not I, but nobody else is either. And so why not look to the process by which they were all composed in the first place? So we don't know how to do it, but nature certainly does, because the whole diversity that stuns us and with its beauty, this diversity of the biological world, is a simple process. It's an algorithmic process of mutation and natural selection. No design, nobody sat down and sat out and wrote out the design of an enzyme. It came about by evolution and has solved all sorts of interesting problems. So why not use a process like evolution? It's not a new idea. I mean, think about it. Humans have been building new biological things for thousands of years by directing their evolution, choosing who mates with whom. We have made things, biological things, that serve us in our bid to populate the planet, right? We can get food from corn that we've bred over generations. We've created in 500 generations or so all these strange dog species that are not remotely natural. I mean, you look at that poodle, that's a production of human beings. And it's not even biologically fit, because in my neighborhood in Los Angeles, that poodle would be eaten by all the coyotes if it got out. We have been modifying the biological world, and we continue to do so. You rub your hands with antibacterial soap, and you're probably promoting the evolution of of resistant bacteria and so on and so forth. So we've been doing this for a long time, but if you think about how evolution happens in nature, right, or in the farmyard even, it's got some pretty limited mechanisms where worms go with worms, monkeys go with monkeys, but you're probably not going to cross monkeys and worms and get anything functional or certainly not anything beautiful out of that. So there are limitations on how you can manipulate the fuel of evolution, the DNA. You can go outside and smoke some cigarettes. I hope you don't, but if you do, you can dial in some mutations in your DNA and contribute to the directed evolution of your offspring. Take a few transatlantic flights. But really, these mechanisms of manipulating the DNA, they're pretty limited. And that's not the case if you're doing it in the laboratory. So let's talk about laboratory science and laboratory evolution. In the test tube, you can mix and match DNA from any organism. You can have any level of mutations you want. So all the rules of biological evolution suddenly become, you're freed from that constraint because you're actually creating it in the test tube. This is Wolford. Wolford is my laboratory mascot. It is a figment of Photoshop. Long before AI-generated imagery, people would generate things like this. I just illustrate the freedom that we have with this picture, but no, I'm not creating Wolfords. But this should open your minds. Gee, if you have the ability to make any DNA you want and to manipulate it in any way, how would you use that capability then to, say, make evolution go in different directions? And so we use that capability. What are the directions? Let's think about the directions that you might want to go in. So what we're doing, think about this, we're freeing ourselves from the constraints of biology, right? Of having to serve the fitness of the organism that makes it. And Therefore, we can now explore a whole universe of possible biologies. And you can explore what's physically possible without these constraints. And let me tell you, this is a universe. So if there's some biologists in the audience, I'm going to insult you first. I've already insulted some of the chemists, but let's insult the biologists. You are studying that little green fraction, tiny fraction of the universe of possible biologies, right? These are the products of all of evolution, all the way back to the beginning of life, fit into the tiniest fraction of what's possible. And in fact, let's just think about it. Oh, and let me just point out, there's some pretty cool things out there in the universe. There's the solution to the energy needs for data centers. There's the cure to cancer. There's even the cure to death and taxes. I'll tell you, it's out there. You just have to find it. But it's such a big space. If you look at some of the numbers, typical protein, typical enzyme, maybe 300 amino acids long, 20 possibilities at each position, 20 amino acid sequences. You start looking at, I change one at a time. I've got thousands of ways to do that. I change 3 at a time. I've got billions of ways to do that. If I change all of them, I've got 20 to the 300th power possible sequences, which is 85 orders of magnitude greater than the number of particles in the universe. So if that's not a big enough playground for you, I don't know what would be. But you have to realize that most of those sequences, even when you're making small numbers of changes, they don't encode anything beautiful. They don't give you the solution to the problems. They don't cure death and taxes, that's for sure. So how do you search this space? And one of the best ways that I ever saw in my life to consider this space came from a short story written by Jorge Luis Borges, a fantastic author who conceived of the library of all possible books that you could get by, let's say, randomly assorting the letters of the English alphabet. And this library, of course, would be vast, but it would also be mostly empty of meaning, right? Most of the random assortment of letters don't encode anything at all. But in this library, there's the book that tells you how to make more money than you could know what to do with. There's the true story of your life from the morning you're born to the time you die. But nobody could find these books, right? The librarians would throw themselves off the balconies in despair of ever finding a meaningful sentence in a book, much less these great pieces of literature. And so you've got this wonderful space, but the really hard problem is how do you walk around in it and find something useful? And for me personally, the answer came from a paper, also a very short story, written by John Maynard Smith and published in 1970, which isn't that much before I went to graduate school. And this paper was written by a person who didn't have access that we have today to all the sequences of enzymes that have been deposited in databases from which you can build family trees and see how evolution came about. So to think about evolution, you know what he had to do? He had to actually just sit down and think about it, right? He just said, okay, and this is what he reasoned. He said, I believe evolution works. Right? I think we are the products of evolution. And in order for evolution to work, what does that tell me about the distribution of functional proteins in this space of all possible sequences? In Borges' library of all possible proteins, for example. And he said that for evolution to work, and this is really a fundamental idea that I'm sharing with you, you have to be able to take one step at a time through this space. Because remember, it grows exponentially as you take more than one step. And so if you take 3 or 4 mutations simultaneously, your probability of retaining function goes away and evolution stops. So he said, I think we have to take one step at a time. And that means that functional proteins have to be surrounded by other functional proteins. And we can walk through this space of genes in order to do that. So turning that into engineering language, which I'm sure will be much clearer to many of you, it means that what we're trying to do is optimize on a fitness landscape, which back then we didn't know the structure of it. But if it's really, really rugged, right, with many peaks, then you take a mutation, you just fall into a crevasse of non-function and evolution stops. And John Maynard Smith made me realize that that's wrong, that the fitness landscape can't look like that, or evolution would have stopped. It has to be smooth in some of its many dimensions. And if it's smooth, any fool can optimize on that, right? You just close your eyes and keep walking uphill, one step at a time. All right, so how do you actually do that? This is the laboratory science. It means that we take from nature, we take a DNA sequence of an enzyme, let's say, that nature's already made, but we want to use it in a new environment or make it work on a new substrate or even do new chemistry. Make a few mutations, not too much, right? If you do too much, you fall into that crevasse. Make a few mutations, use recombinant DNA technology to convert that into proteins, right, through recombinant cells. And then comes the analytical chemistry, and that's really important because when I started these experiments, 96 well plate readers were new technology. You could actually do 96 experiments at once and look at kinetics of enzymes. And now, of course, we use a lot of things like HPLC and mass spectrometry to do these measurements. So you have to actually screen, and that was critical for doing this because most mutations are deleterious, right? They don't give you something better, and in the old days, those went straight to the trash can. But if you've asked the right kind of question where you're looking for an improvement in the technology and you make your measurements carefully so you're not, just dealing with noise, you can find those beneficial mutations, iterate, feed the DNA back into the process, and at the end you might have something that's much better. So it looks like this, where you're starting with something that nature made in blue. It's generally very good at what it does in the biological system. You ask it to do something new, as I explained, it's less enthusiastic about that, but turn the crank of mutation and artificial selection, you can push it back up that hill and the enzyme starts doing its new job. And that process is so simple and so robust that people started using it. Why would we want to use it? Again, I'm looking at a future where chemistry will be DNA encoded. Almost all the chemistry that we use could be DNA encoded, and that way we could take renewable resources, for example, in chemical factories like microbes and create what we need in our daily lives. And I'll just give you a few concrete examples. This isn't just pie in the sky. You can make jet fuel. This is a company we formed back in 2004. They make jet fuel from renewable resources. This is a company that some of my students formed in 2019. They can take an enzyme that plugs serine and basically anything on that to make non-canonical amino acids. They're the sole supplier in the United States for these non-canonicals at ton scale. You can interfere with insect sex. You can make authentic pheromones for insects and replace pesticides by Chanel number 5, where you confuse the male, he starts flying around and says, oh, she's everywhere, and you can't find the female moth, and so they don't, make caterpillars in your corn. So all these wonderful chemicals that would be too expensive to make using human chemistry suddenly become easy to make in biological systems. So that's what you could do. And that's what directed evolution enabled us to do. And of course, hundreds of laboratories started using the method because it was so easy to use. And everything from the enzymes in your DNA sequencing to laundry detergents. You know, laundry detergents, a very interesting thing. What self-respecting natural enzyme wants to work in your washing machine? It doesn't, with bleach and surfactants, but these were all evolved to do that. And a number of other applications came about. And that got me the greatest accolade of my life when I was asked to go and appear on The Big Bang Theory back in, oh gosh, it was a long time ago now. Because, what kind of, is this a nerd audience? How many people watch The Big Bang Theory? Yeah, it's a good nerd audience. It's about endearing graduate students at Caltech in physics who, oh, did I do that? I don't think so. What happened here? I don't know, maybe you can pull that up again for me. Anyway, it's about endearing graduate students who, after 12 seasons, went on to become professors, and suddenly they were lobbying for Nobel Prizes. So that it's a good thing the show is over, because it's certainly degraded. But it was a lot of fun to wander down to Burbank Studios, which is not far from my house, and appear on that. We're going to pull that. Yeah, well, while you're messing with that, I'll tell you another anecdote. I also got invited to a really nice party in 2018. So I got invited to this great party in Stockholm in the middle of December, which is really cold and dark there. It was really cold and dark there, but it is such a good party. I have to say, if you ever get invited, you should go. It was a fantastic experience, and I took 60 friends and family with me. All right. I have to get back to the chemistry now. So here we have this tremendous process, right, of evolving things and taking what nature had already done and maybe making it slightly different. And I got tired of that after a while. I was doing it, you know, with many interesting examples and starting companies and all that, yeah. But I then got annoyed by people like David Baker. You all know him? And Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2024. And we were in this furious race of who would design new enzymes. And I said, when he started designing enzymes that could do chemistry you cannot find in nature, I said, oh my goodness, that really pisses me off. Because I didn't know how to do that, right? You think about an enzyme, you're trying to put multiple functional groups simultaneously to stabilize a transition state. And I thought, this positioning of multiple things simultaneously would be too big a combinatorial problem, right? If you have 5 changes at the same time, you have to screen a gazillion things, and nobody's going to do HPLC on a gazillion things. Maybe, some small fraction. And then I realized I was thinking about the problem all wrong. Everything, it was just the wrong way to do about it. And why is that? I was thinking about the problem wrong because nature makes new enzymes all the time. And she doesn't do it using AI, right? It's all experimental. And so that must mean that new enzymes are evolving. And they're evolving by taking one step at a time. How does that happen? That happens, and I'll just jump to the thing because I don't have all my nice illustrations, but if you think about it, things like antibiotic resistance or herbicide resistance, right? We're dumping atrazine out onto the planet and it's accumulating, and then boom, all of a sudden, some organism figures out that if it pops a chlorine off of atrazine, it has a rich nitrogen source that suddenly gives it a selective advantage over its neighbors. And a new enzyme comes up in 50 years. How does that happen? It happens. And this is a really important letter. How does innovation happen to get new chemistry? It happens because it's already there. It's already there in this vast diversity of the biological world. There's already there someone who has a little bit of capability, a so-called promiscuous capability. A promiscuous capability that can be drawn out as the fuel of evolution. So there we go. And that's an important lesson too, right? Because if you have a diversity of ideas, somebody might come up with something. If you have a diversity of genes, somebody comes up with a solution. Now, in the laboratory, I don't have that 10 to the 9th or 10 to the 10th diversity, so I actually have to contaminate my experiments with a little bit of thought. Are we on there? Oh, okay, good. All right, so let's see. I've got to get my slides back. Okay, let me jump ahead. All right, so I want to create new chemistry, right? Chemistry not found in the biological world. I want to innovate using evolution. And I've just explained to you that this can happen using directed evolution if you're smart enough to know what promiscuous capabilities are already there in the biological world. And that's the design fraction of it. So let me give you an example. This is my favorite example because, I developed this example because I wanted to open people's minds. I don't know about you, but some of us wonder, why isn't silicon present in organic systems? Why aren't carbon-silicon bonds present? Well, you know, it may be because they're really lousy, right? But, you know, there's a lot of silicon there in the natural world. It's the second most abundant element on the planet. But you never find it you never find organosilicon compounds in nature. There are a lot of organosilicon compounds in this room. Humans make literally tons and tons and tons of these things. The earbuds, your hair gels, caulks, sealants, paints. There's probably 50 products or more in this room that contain carbon-silicon bonds. So it's a vast industry that never considered biology because you never see carbon-silicon bonds in biology. So we said, can we make an enzyme that forges carbon-silicon bonds? Can we use evolution to do that? So that means you have to think about what is a mechanism nature could use if if there was a promiscuous activity out there. And so we took a cytochrome P450 that naturally makes a high energy intermediate, this iron oxo, and can transfer oxygen into an organic substrate to make a carbon-oxygen bond. And so we said, that iron oxo has some chemical resemblance to a carbene, a friend of chemists. There's no carbene chemistry known in biology, but chemists use it all the time to form new carbon X bonds. So we said, okay, let's give it a go. Let's ask if iron, and there was no report of iron ever catalyzing carbene transfer in this way, but we said, let's just see if we could get it to catalyze this carbene transfer, an asymmetric version of that. And if it could do that, if it had a little bit of activity towards that, is that evolvable? So in fact, it is. It's present. There is already out there in nature proteins that can catalyze the formation of carbon-silicon bonds. It's just no one ever asked it before. But we found readily a number of heme proteins that could do it. We found this particular one that I love because it comes from a hot salty pool in Iceland, and no, we didn't go there. We took it from a database. But and we also like it because it's a little tiny protein. It's very small. It's so small you can give it to a chemist. And they won't even know it's a protein. You could lyophilize it and put a powder in a thing and say, Arnold's magic, carbene transfer catalyst. And it does this chemistry that I show up here. It'll take dimethylphenylsilane and not a natural compound, obviously, and this carbene precursor, and it'll form with 40 turnovers, this silicon-carbon bond, and do it with as good enantioselectivity as any human had ever reported. And it's just sitting out there waiting to say, here I am, I could do this, but nobody ever asked until we asked it. And when I first talked about this, I had a bunch of experts sitting in the front row, and one guy, a real expert on cytochrome C, jumps up and says, Francis, don't you know there's no active site in a cytochrome C? So how does this happen? And in fact, if you roll your little computer ball over the active site of the protein, you come up with a big fat 0 for the volume. But you know what? Nature really does not care about your calculations. Because this protein catalyzes this reaction. And obviously, this structural representation bears no resemblance to what's actually happening in the active site of the protein, because the there's a methionine and a histidine that occupy, the axial sites, and the equatorial sites are all in the heme. So, yeah, you might think it doesn't do it, but you talk yourself out of even trying. But the protein does it very happily, and it evolves. So you start cranking on the machinery of directed evolution, making mutations and looking for improvements. We could improve it 50-fold, make it 50-fold better than any human catalyst. And the humans use iridium and platinum and all sorts of ridiculously expensive metals. Here, this protein does it with earth-abundant iron, does it beautifully, and suddenly becomes 50 times better than any of the best human catalysts. And 50 times better, we said, okay, that's good enough to get published in a snooty journal. And so we stopped there, and the rest was history. It works inside of bacterial cells. So these non-natural substrates, go right into bacteria, product comes out, and suddenly we had a living system that can form carbon-silicon bonds. Okay, so I was in another conference, and Bob Service of Science magazine jumps up in the front row and says, that's so cool, I have to write about it. And I said, no, and he wants to ask me more about it. And I said, no, I can't talk because it's going to be published soon, and you're not supposed to do, zip your lip, right? You're not supposed to do science by press release. So what did he do? He went and he made up a story. He said, we're taking a step towards silicon-based life. Well, I'll tell you, the paper said nothing like that, because it was a really boring chemistry paper in Science magazine with 130 pages of SI. Nobody read the science paper. But this story went all over the world. And so, especially with, Dr. Spock and Captain Kirk, does anybody know the Horta episode where they're looking for life in rocks? Okay, there you go. They used the Horta episode, and that suddenly, then it goes all over the world, and the story went all over the world, and it mutated as it went. So if you read the paper, it bears no resemblance to this, but what fun. People had so much fun with it. So Popular Science took me to task and said, I never said this, but Popular Science says, I don't think so, so don't hold your breath. There's very good chemical reasons why silicon won't show up in organic systems, but astrobiology loved it. So, all 17 readers of Astrobiology magazine clicked on that one, making it the most popular article of the year. You get to the intelligent design community, and I know we're in Texas, but I hope you're intelligent. The intelligent design community says, oh, this has got to be, intelligent design. And I raised my hand. Yep, here we are. Evolution is intelligent design. And then the best reviews came from the former Twitter. So if you ever want great reviews of your paper, post it on Twitter. We were rolling on the floor laughing at some of these. I'll let you read what they have to say. it caught people's imaginations. That's exactly what we wanted to do. It was a stupid example, but it was something that really caught people's imaginations. And that paper, it was published in 2016, has led to an explosion of interest in finding all the crazy, wonderful things that biology can do, but nobody ever asked before. And now there's thousands of new chemical reactions that enzymes have been evolved to do, that all came out of this. And I'll just point out, we added 2 whole new elements to the periodic table of life. You know, if you look at carbon X bonds, there's lots of, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and halogens, and a few metals, but most of it's empty. We added boron and silicon in less than a year. So I'll leave the rest to the periodic chart for you all to fill in. Now, I feel that if you make bonds, you should break them. And that means, if you look at organosilicon, these are accumulating on the planet. Silicones are everywhere. And we're making more of it all the time, but it's not biodegradable. And some of the degradation products of silicones are banned in the EU. And there's no enzyme that's known. Well, there wasn't any enzyme known to make them. Now we've solved that problem. There's no enzyme known to break those bonds. And I feel if you make it, you need to be able to break it. So we took on a challenge with funding from Dow Chemical, who makes a lot of these products, and found enzymes that break the carbon silicon bonds. They're not good enough for biodegradation, but I'm hoping that over the years we'll be able to make them better. So what's great about evolution is it just continually expands out. So once we showed that carbene transfer, a new whole mechanism was available to DNA-encoded catalysts, we were able to develop hundreds of new carbene transferases, making crazy stuff like bicyclobutanes from alkynes and really strained rings. You can make explosives with these things, and a whole bunch of different reactions, and this is just a tiny fraction. But it doesn't stop there, right? Why would it stop there? If you can transfer carbenes, why not transfer nitrines and open up a whole new world of carbon-nitrogen chemistry? And nitrine transfer is not a mechanism known in nature either, but it's quite easy for biology to figure out how to do that. And I'll give you one example, a recent example that Zhiqi Li came up with, and this was funded by the Gates Foundation, to make processes that would make these I hate saying this, oxazolidinone antibiotics, because tuberculosis is the worst killer, bacterial pathogen killer in the world. And if you can make these things cheap enough, then perhaps these drugs would be available in the poverty-stricken regions where this disease still wreaks havoc. They're pretty complicated to synthesize chemically, but Zhiqi Li and my group proposed that if you could transfer a nitrine to an unactivated alkene, this is hard stuff, to make the aziridine, right? You've got your 3-membered nitrogen-containing ring. Maybe she could also, in an active site of an enzyme, get this ring formation, intramolecular ring formation reaction to, in a single step from a simple precursor, make the core of these antibiotics. You could do it in a single step. That's a crazy idea, but it's not crazy, because we have now this huge refrigerator full of these, these enzymes that have been evolved for other reactions, and they all have promiscuous activities. So she just, did analytical chemistry to measure the activities of our collection, and by golly, she found a couple that had the tiniest bit of activity, and then she was able to evolve those, so that now all of these interesting compounds can be made in a single step. And I love this example. Earlier, we had published examples where you just plug an amino function onto unactivated carbons in hydrocarbons. That's crazy chemistry. That's chemistry not known in nature or known in human chemistry. And we can do it with hydroxylamine. No human chemist knows how to do that. But we made enzymes that can do that, and Derek Lowe You don't want to be in Derek Lowe's eyesight, usually he's very critical, but he said, here's one of those reactions that looks like alchemy to what those of us in the synthetic organic community. They look like magic. They do chemistry that cannot be done with the reagents we have now. It's not magic, though. It's not magic. It's happening in this self-assembling, DNA-encoded chiral metal complex that is a protein. So, and not only is this wonderful chiral metal complex, but it's eminently tunable by this incredible process of evolution, and all through the DNA. So you don't have to synthesize all the ligands and make some new metal complex. You just mutate the DNA to get that. I want to spend 2 minutes on AI and what's the role of AI. I love directed evolution, but boy, is it a royal pain in the you-know-what. It's a lot of experiments. And this audience appreciates the experiments. Not everybody appreciates doing hundreds and hundreds of experiments in the screening. So the reason is, right, we're taking one step at a time. So you get stuck on bad peaks and you're wandering around in the space. So how do we get away from having to do all these experiments? And this is the promise of AI. So remember in the old days, you do the screening and you throw the bad ones in the trash can. Well, nothing is bad anymore. We can take those data and build models. So now the process looks like this. This is the way we do directed evolution. We insert a machine learning model into the system, taking all of the screening data, build models, and use that then to traverse the fitness landscape, maybe 2 or 3 steps at a time, or 4 or 5 steps at a time, capturing a little bit of the local ruggedness. And with neural networks, we can incorporate into the models information from increasingly rich databases. So this is how directed evolution is done. Now we use an active learning, so we build the models in each generation. We can update the models in an active fashion. We can do things like Bayesian analysis, uncertainty quantification to choose where we go next. But it's still this accumulation of beneficial mutations in a machine learning guided process. And then the last little piece, generative AI. Remember I said we were lucky because we found in the refrigerator an enzyme that had a little bit of activity for what we really wanted to make the tuberculosis drugs. Well, there are many things we don't have. We don't have a starting point. And evolution, you have to have a starting point. Well, now with generative AI, that starting point will soon come from AI. The models are getting better all the time, and they don't have to be perfect. With this evolutionary optimization, you can take something that's really bad and turn it into something quite good, reliably. That's a superpower. That's a superpower that biology gives us. And it's something that you don't find in any other human-engineered system. It's only in biology. So now we have this generative AI, and I'll just leave this if anybody's really interested in this topic. I recommend Jason Yang's paper on this. Basically what we do is combine the generative AI model with machine learning guided evolution all in one body. And well, it's a joke, but it's not really a joke. The graduate student can push a button and genetically encode any chemistry. And this was from a Twitter post I did in 2022. I said, we will be able to push a button and make any enzyme you want. Now notice this was on April Fool's Day. Everybody was going crazy about ChatGPT, so I said, let's do an April Fool's joke. But it wasn't a joke, because I knew that in a few years this would be true. And so this is the reality that's coming to fruition in the next few years, is that we will be able to push a button and genetically encode chemistry. I want to end with what I did for 4 years after the prize. I co-chaired President Biden's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in the White House for 4 years. This is a volunteer position. and I directed a council of 30 of really fantastic scientists and engineers who also volunteered their time to provide advice to the executive office on science and technology. And it was a very moving experience to see people come together and try to use science to help guide government policy. He didn't always listen to us, but he was there and willing to consider science among many other considerations. And I'll just end with this, I think, really important message. When I was introduced to the country in 2021, January 2021, remember where you were. We didn't have vaccines yet. We were in the midst of a global pandemic. Our parents were dying in nursing homes. My mother died in a nursing home during this time. My brother died in a hospital in Arizona. It was a really awful time for us. And we wanted science to come and do something good for us. And on the wall behind me, so there's a little bit of, maybe you can see the binary code. I want to see, are there any real nerds in here who can read binary? Oh, okay. Well, I'll just translate it for you. In the binary code, it says hope over fear, unity over division, science over fiction, truth over lies. And that's what science brings to us. It gives us the ability to do that, and I hope you will take that message forward and use that in your own work. This is what we can do. This is our superpower. Thank you.